How's everybody doing? Today's video is going to be about what I think Chapman guitars could learn from Gibson. Now, obviously, I am a big Gibson fan. I have a handful of them, and they are my favorite guitars. So despite what you might be thinking as this video starts, or what you might be thinking as to why you clicked on it, this video is actually not about build quality or anything like that at all. This video is about what seems to be happening with Chapman guitars recently as far as their business model. This is just my own view from as an outsider, as a customer of all types of guitars. You know, I don't have any affiliation with any guitar brands, I'll just say that, but I do feel a little bit like I have a dog in the fight with wanting Chapman guitars to succeed. I don't want to see Chapman guitars as a company being a flash in the pan. And I know that they've been around now for a number of years. I know that they've gone from just a small distributing model to now stocking guitars at Guitar Center and bigger distributors like that. And I think they're probably doing okay, but I think they may be on the precipice of doing worse, is what it seems like. And I could be totally wrong about this. I mean, that's one of the things about a privately held company like that, is you don't ever really know how their sales are doing, you know, how healthy the company is. But just from an outside perspective, and I know a lot of other people in the guitar community have been talking about this, especially with their number one artist, Rabi Assad, leaving the company. He's broken ties with Chapman guitars very recently. So another artist, I guess, that they had went from Chapman to Schecter. So here's what it seems like. I'm speaking based on what it seems like that Chapman guitars, although they may still be doing fine, you know, who knows really. It seems to me like they are nearing a point where they could take a turn for the worse. So this is my view on how to prevent that, something that they could learn. And also, I do feel a little bit like I have a dog in the fight with this, because when I was growing up, I was not in a position where my family could afford to just buy super nice guitars. So I always had like beginner level guitars when I was learning how to play growing up. And once I had like my first job and I started actually earning money, I started to realize that I had a little bit of buying power and I could buy some guitars or gear that I wanted based on the position that I was in, where I didn't have to pay rent. My grandparents, I'm very grateful that they let me stay with them during that time and they didn't make me pay them rent. And this allowed me to learn a few lessons as far as wasteful spending, which is that I bought a bunch of guitars that I was sort of trying out. Anyway, so as soon as I was able to earn a little bit of money for myself, I knew it was important to me to eventually buy a better guitar than what I was using, which was basically a couple of hot-rodded Agile AL bodies, you know, Les Paul copies. And I was always a fan of Les Paul players, but that seemed to me like that to buy a Gibson Les Paul was like something that would never happen. It was like up in the stratosphere, like I could never afford that type of thing. So I still felt that way, and I was watching guitar videos, and I was watching some videos that came out with Rob Chapman and Lee Anderton, the captain, and Rabi Assad was just coming on the scene at that time. And even really, I guess it was right around the time that Chapman guitars launched to where you could buy them in the United States from Riff City Guitar at the time. From watching Rob Chapman's videos, I was able to tell that he had an extreme ear for detail. He was doing all these blindfolded challenges and listening for things, and he definitely could tell what certain components of guitars would have certain effects on the sound and the performance of the guitar. He was clearly an expert at that point. He had a lot of time in the field, but he didn't really have a successful guitar company yet, but it was just getting off the ground. So I had a lot of respect for Rob Chapman's opinion as far as what he had an eye and an ear for with guitar designs. So I was very interested when Chapman guitars made in world music in Korea were available to buy in the United States. And so the first sort of like mid-level guitar that I ever bought, although to me it was way nicer than anything I'd ever had before as far as fit and finish and quality materials and everything like that, was I bought an original run Chapman ML2, which I had years ago because I was a Les Paul fan. So I obviously went with the single cutaway, but I found pretty quickly that that guitar was really not very similar to a Les Paul in a lot of ways, but it was still a killer guitar. And at that time, it seemed like the principle of the company Chapman Guitars was to make guitars which were sort of bare bones visually, but they were like all natural wood finishes, more or less. As far as I know, I think maybe it was the ML1 that was the first to get like a trans black option and this and that, but they had very, very basic finishes and very like, not necessarily open pore, because they did use a lot of wood fillers. They used sapele, which is already pretty dense to begin with. But they just had this natural, bare bones, but very high quality feel. Like, you could tell it was a very fine product, and there was no extra money being wasted on the finish or anything visual that would increase the price, but not necessarily the performance. So I really like that idea. I always have liked guitars that are either black, white, or wood. So they had just guitars that looked like wood. That was great because they were just all natural. And it kept their prices down because they didn't have all these additional visual frills that companies like LTD or Schecter Diamond Series were doing. So at that time, I got one of every Chapman. I bought the ML2 and the ML1, and I was given the ML3 as a gift, and they were phenomenal. I mean, I slightly regret selling them, but there was a point in time where they weren't getting a lot of use, and they probably still wouldn't get a lot of use if I still had them, but I regret selling them at the time that I did because they were, I think, all around $500 to $600 to buy, which is a really, really good price for a guitar of that quality. And now the Korean Chapmans, of course, are like twice the price. As with anything coming out of that factory, it's not their fault, but they had to split off and do an Indonesian standard series, which I think is what this one is. Yes, it is. So this was a standard series that I bought after the fact, and this guitar, you know, I bought this after I sold my other Chapmans and I was just playing Gibsons, strictly because I like the brand so much, and this guitar was signed by Rob Chapman and Rabia Masad, both Chapman obviously of Chapman Guitars, and Rabia Masad, a huge artist for Chapman Guitars, probably their first signature artist, and a player who I respect immensely his playing style. So to see Rabia Masad recently leave the company, and there's people talking about what, you know, is Chapman Guitars going to fail, which I don't think they're going to fail, but there's people speculating online because that's a pretty major thing, and it does seem like it weakens the company for Rabia Masad to leave. So that's why people, I think, are feeling that Chapman Guitars, the company, is appearing weaker, and they very well may not be, but that's just how it appears. Again, they're a private company. We can't really tell that. So over the past couple of years, I've noticed that essentially from the point that they split off to do the standard series and the pro series, which I understand why they felt the need to do that, because world music probably had increased their prices so much at that point based on their reputation, you know, charging what they deserve basically, because they do make some of the highest quality guitars in the world, in my view. But ever since the point roughly where Chapman split off to do the standard series and the pro series, maybe they felt like they needed to branch out and do some new finishes to differentiate those two product lines between themselves and between their competition. And that may be the case, but that was where they started to go away from their original principle of a visually stripped down guitar, where they paid extreme attention to the choice of materials, the shape of the cutaway to make everything the most ergonomic. You have great fret access, you have all these great benefits to having a Chapman guitar. But now they started focusing more on different finishes and making them fancier, I think maybe as an attempt to justify the price and to differentiate themselves between the competition. And so this is where, at this point in time, I think there's enough perspective for me to pause and look at what happened to Gibson guitars when they went through their struggles a few years ago, and draw a parallel to Chapman guitars and what they may face on their current trajectory. This, again, my own speculation. So with Gibson guitars, we all know that we had the previous CEO, who was in there for a while, was pretty controversial because he had some models that were fine for decades, and then due to other factors besides the design of the guitars, Gibson guitars started to lose ground in the market. So the fundamental design of the guitar, the original Les Paul design, the 50s models, the 60s models, at their core, there was nothing wrong with those, but the CEO of Gibson figured that in order to generate some more sales, he would need to innovate a little bit. So they did that both with some weird finishes and with some features that people ultimately were put off by, and it actually did a lot more harm than good, and they ended up having to file bankruptcy, and he's out of a job. So then once Gibson was brought under the control of their current and new CEO, he got them past the bankruptcy and into an era of a lot less innovation in a way, and focusing on their strengths. So they do still offer some innovative features, and they have two different lineups. They have like the classic series and the modern series. That may or may not be what they're called, but that's how it seems. So the classic series has your Les Paul standard, in the way that people expect it to be, not with all these weird features, and the market loved that. And then the modern series, they are innovating very slowly. They took a huge step backwards from where they were at the peak of their misstep in 2015. And now they're just very slowly creeping forward with innovation because they realize that that's not valuable to their business model. And I wonder if at this point Chapman guitars could learn something similar to that. And what I mean is, it seems to me like when I keep seeing all these posts of Chapman guitars saying, we've come out with 3 new finishes, we've come out with 2 new finishes, we've redesigned this, we've redesigned that, it seems like, and yes, they have a right to innovate because their whole ethos as a company was, innovative physical features and designs, but it seems to me like they're trying to stir up interest by coming out with new colors. And this is against the original principle of Chapman, which was basic designs, basic wood, and you don't really need anything more than that, and it keeps the prices down, and that was their differentiating factor. And I get that it may be hard or harder than it used to be to differentiate with price, just because it might be so expensive to build those Korean Chapmans. But surely it would still be cheaper to build them in their original way than it would be to build them in a way that competes with some of these weird Schecter finishes that are coming out of the same factory for the same price, I think that the original principles of Chapman are kind of being forgotten by them doing that. As a fan of the original series, you know, that came out of Korea, I don't really have any interest in those ones because the cost is so high that I might as well buy a Gibson at that price. That's why I don't buy those really expensive Schecters either. I mean, it's just, at that point, the cost is very high. If Chapman could strip some of their features back, some of those finishes that are probably adding cost, and go back to the more, you know, satin, natural feeling wood, I think that their part of the market that they deserve would probably appreciate that, because at this point they have basically been abandoned. I mean, who's making guitars that are like that anymore if Chapman is making guitars that are now basically like Schecters? I mean, they're kind of losing what differentiated them, and they're losing the core of what made them popular. Gibson guitars in the 50s and 60s were popular because at the time the design was new and it was a great design. And that design held up for decades afterwards. Well, granted, they had a lot more, there wasn't a whole lot of variety and competition in the guitar market, but that design of the Les Paul, the SG, the Flying V, those guitars stood the test of time for decades. They started to fall off, again, not due to the design of the guitar, but due to probably certain PR blunders, mishandling of signature artists. They didn't seem to really care if people saw their guitars on stage, even though that still did matter at the time, that they thought it didn't. They thought they were probably too big to fail in that aspect. But then they tried to compensate by innovating all these finishes and features, and it didn't help them in the slightest. And I'm afraid to see Chapman follow exactly in that same path of Gibson, where their original design was great, and looking at this on a smaller time scale, but similar thing that happened, their original design was great. They start losing market, and so they start innovating on colors and things that the original people didn't really care about. So I have a feeling that unless Chapman goes back to the original priorities that they used to have with the natural finishes, that those guitars are going to become very sought after by comparison on the used market, and the new ones are going to have a harder and harder time to differentiate themselves against other modern guitar companies. That's my individual opinion. I don't know if that holds any weight really, but I suspect that something like that, a parallel like that, could be drawn in this case. If you have somehow enjoyed listening to me ramble about this through this whole video, then I appreciate it. Give the video a like, write a comment if you could see something like that happening, if you think I might be onto something. I think Chapman is barking up the wrong tree as far as how they're trying to earn back share. And, you know, I don't want to see them even really reduce their market share, much less fail, because I think it's a great brand. That's why I have this guitar signed by Rob Chapman. So obviously it means something to me. If you guys have any sort of similar thoughts or comparisons to make with other companies, write about it in the comments below. I'd like to read them. And if you like this video, don't forget to share it and subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you guys next time.